There's a moment in every civilization when the light is too perfect, when the walls gleam too much, the harvests are too rich, the people too certain that tomorrow will be identical to today. That's the moment right before the break. Tonight, I want to take you to the last sunrise of the first great age of humankind, when the world still breathed gold and the sea had not yet remembered its rage. This isn't a tale of fantasy. It's a reconstruction of the oldest pattern we know, a rise so bright it burned its own memory, and a fall so complete it became myth. Before we dive deeper, I'd love it if you'd subscribe and tell me where you're listening from right now, whether it's night outside your window, dawn rising, or rain tapping on your roof. I read every comment. It helps me imagine where these words travel, how the echoes of this story spread. Because the one thing that never changes is connection. The same current that once linked the last king to the people who watched his city drown. So let's begin. When we speak of a golden age, we imagine light without shadow. But perfection is a terrible pressure. Beneath every polished temple floor, there are the bones of experiments, failures, corrections, sacrifices. The civilization we're about to exhume lived on the knife's edge between brilliance and collapse. They conquered weather. They engineered abundance. They treated time itself like a commodity, harvested in cycles so precise that the moon was a clock, the sun a contract. And at the center of it all stood a ruler whose very name has been reduced to symbol, the last king. His story begins not in a palace but in silence, the silence of records too clean, of dates too round. The scribes of his age erased chaos so thoroughly that even their precision feels suspicious. Tablets and inscriptions describe a reign of perfect order, floods predicted to the hour, trade routes that never faltered, harvests that never failed. Perfection doesn't persist by accident. It persists because someone is enforcing it. Someone who knows that chaos begins with small permissions. And that someone, history tells us, was him. He wasn't born a tyrant. His early decrees read like the work of an idealist, a man trying to hold civilization together with sheer intelligence. The system he inherited had been designed by ancestors who believed balance was divine law. Every temple mirrored a warehouse, every ritual measured in grain and labor hours, every poem shadowed by mathematics. But over time, he became the system's prisoner. To maintain perfection, he had to silence the unpredictable, dissent, discovery, emotion. That's the paradox of a golden age. To keep the light steady, you must extinguish every flicker. The archaeological record betrays what the chronicles deny. Layers of habitation show a creeping sterility. The early strata are wild with experimentation. Pottery styles evolve yearly, alloys change, architecture plays with form. Then suddenly, uniformity. Kilns firing identical jars. Scripts carved in regulated height. We see efficiency, but we also see fear. The artisans stopped experimenting. Innovation froze. The society had optimized itself into stasis. The golden age became a gilded cage. In his capital, the king built what chroniclers called the Hall of Continuance, a building without corners, domed like a captured horizon. Its walls were a map of the heavens, traced with inlaid copper so finely set that when torchlight moved, the constellations appeared to shift. Scholars now believe it was more than a temple. It was an instrument, a mechanism to track celestial alignments. The priests called it the ear of the sky. From here, the king's astronomers could predict tides, eclipses, even the faint seasonal variations that dictated flood and drought. But over time, the data became doctrine. Observation turned into obedience. The sky itself was no longer mystery, it was bureaucracy. And then the signals began to change. Records inscribed on obsidian tablets, found far from the capital in what were likely research outposts, show erratic readings, stars appearing a day early, the moon running fast. The observers were alarmed. The cycles they had trusted for generations were faltering. To the king's council, this wasn't a cosmic anomaly, it was heresy. The laws of heaven couldn't be wrong, only their interpreters. Several tablets end mid-sentence as if confiscated. We don't find the astronomers again. Meanwhile, the sea was changing. Sediment cores pulled from the drowned deltas show a spike in storm debris, sand from far coasts, pulverized coral, traces of forest charcoal. The climate was shifting violently, though the people of the capital wouldn't have known why. They had forgotten that nature's laws were not laws at all, only temporary truces. The temples insisted on stability. The priests chanted formulas that promised the floods would come on schedule, and for a while they did, until the year they didn't. That year began with good omens. Comets arched across the dawn, which the priests interpreted as gifts. The harvest overfilled the granaries. The last king, now aging, took it as confirmation that his control was divine. He ordered the construction of what would become his final monument, the Gate of Suns, a structure aligned to capture the exact moment of the year's longest light. But when the solstice came, the light never touched the inner chamber. The alignment had drifted. Something immense had changed in the heavens. The calculations no longer worked. The king ordered corrections. Teams of astronomers recalculated, architects rebuilt, the temples adjusted their rituals by a fraction of a day. But the pattern didn't return. The stars kept sliding, the tides grew unpredictable, and then, abruptly, the river turned violent. Floods that should have come gently instead came as walls of water, uprooting trees, crushing villages. The engineers built barriers higher, but each one failed faster than the last. The king, refusing to accept defeat, declared that the elements were rebelling against humanity's pride. He called it a moral plague. Punishments followed. We find evidence of mass burials near the great canals, engineers and priests buried together, perhaps sacrificed, perhaps executed. The administrative seals vanish after this layer. The bureaucracy collapsed almost overnight. The empire that had measured everything suddenly couldn't measure itself. Survivors fled inland, leaving behind cities designed for a world that no longer existed. The mythology that survived centuries later remembers this as divine retribution, a flood sent by angry gods to punish arrogance. But when we look closer, the pattern matches a planetary event: abrupt climate shift, regional tectonic subsidence, oceanic surge. The divine wrath was geology. The moral failure was overconfidence in a system that mistook knowledge for immunity. The Golden Age ended not because humanity sinned, but because it believed it had nothing left to learn. One artifact, found at the deepest level of the drowned capital, carries an inscription so faint it took infrared imaging to read. It's only 12 words, but they break the heart. The king kept the light burning, though the fuel was gone. Those words aren't prophecy, they're confession. Someone, maybe the last scribe, maybe the king himself, understood what was happening. They knew the age was ending, not with war, but with exhaustion. A civilization that had forgotten how to bend was about to break. The collapse wasn't instant. For decades, the remnants persisted in scattered enclaves, clinging to rituals that no longer matched the sky. We find their shrines buried beneath younger cultures, the same symbols reappearing under new names, the same geometry reinterpreted. That's how memory survives catastrophe, disguised as faith, carried by song. The legacy of the first civilization didn't vanish. It went underground, whispering through the myths of every culture that followed. And at the center of all those whispers stands the same figure, the ruler who would not yield. Some called him the last king, others the keeper of days, others simply the man who tried to stop time. His story is the hinge between prehistory and memory. To some he's a villain, to others a tragic hero who refused to accept that even perfection obeys entropy. The truth is simpler. He was human, brilliant, terrified, and wrong. When the waters finally rose for the last time, they say he climbed the steps of his temple, the one that no longer aligned with the sun, and looked out over a horizon that shimmered with lightning. He had built a world that measured everything, except humility. And in that final moment, as the ocean advanced like a living thing, he understood the one equation his civilization never solved, that balance is not control, and the world is not a machine to be ruled, but a partner that must be heard. The storm swallowed the capital before dawn. When it cleared, the city was gone. What remained were fragments scattered like punctuation across continents, but in those fragments lies the outline of a warning, one we keep failing to hear. Every empire believes it is the last king's opposite, wiser, safer, more advanced. Yet the pattern endures. We rise, we optimize, we silence doubt, and the cycle begins again. That's where we end tonight's chapter, on the eve of the Cataclysm, with a civilization too perfect to survive its own precision. In the next part, we'll descend into the ruins themselves, layer by layer, and see what their bones still whisper about the moment the light went out. The flood wasn't a single event. It was a slow annihilation disguised as weather. When you stand over the sediment cores taken from the drowned plains, you can see it written like a heartbeat gone arrhythmic. Fine layers of silt, then thicker bands of chaos, ash, bone dust, and volcanic glass. It didn't happen in one night, no matter what the stories say. It happened over decades, a long surrender, where the planet itself began to pulse out of sync with its own rhythms. The last king had tried to manage nature like an accountant manages books, but nature doesn't balance. It resets. Archaeologists call this period the terminal oscillation, an era when the sky seemed to change color without warning. The auroras reached farther south, and storms came from directions no one remembered. The old markers, carved in stone to predict the floods, began to lie. The river rose on the wrong moon. The winds reversed, scattering seed instead of sowing it. For a civilization built on predictability, this was madness made visible. The last king doubled the offerings to the gods of measurement, hoping to bribe the cosmos back into order. Instead, he unleashed the machinery of fear. His empire, once serene, began to fracture from the inside. Temples accused one another of heresy. Astronomers fled their towers. The scribes who used to record grain now recorded omens. Birds flying backward, crops germinating in winter, stars blinking out of their positions. Panic had a bureaucracy. The king's ministers issued decrees to rename the seasons. If the year disobeys, one tablet reads, we will rename the year. The arrogance was almost tender, as if language could rewrite physics. Meanwhile, the people who lived at the edges, the fishermen, the miners, the artisans, who didn't kneel at the hall of continuance, saw what was coming. They built rafts and left. At first, they were mocked as deserters, but when the first inner delta disappeared beneath the tide, no one laughed. Oral legends found thousands of miles apart all described the same pattern: ships carrying bundles of glowing stones, families who claimed to serve the King of Light, landing on foreign shores. That diaspora may be the root of every myth of wise strangers who built with impossible skill. Back in the capital, the king turned to what he called the Second Covenant. It was meant to save the heart of the empire by building upward, a plan to lift the city above the water. Excavations show a ring of massive foundations laid atop older buildings, as if they were trying to build a platform the size of a mountain. Each pillar was filled with layers of mineral sand, lime and ash, primitive concrete, still stronger than what followed for millennia. But the project consumed everything: food, labor, and faith. Those who questioned it vanished into the quarries. The king was no longer a ruler. He was a man trying to outbuild the tide. The surviving inscriptions from his reign grow frantic. The calligraphy deteriorates. The spacing widens. At first, every line begins with his full title, the Lord of the perfect cycle, then just the Lord, then only his symbol, a disc with a fracture through the center, the emblem of a sun no longer whole. The priests began to whisper that the fracture in his seal was a curse. But there was no curse. There was only gravity and hubris. Around this time, something extraordinary appears in the record, the invention of fireproof vaults. Deep beneath what had been the administrative quarter, archaeologists have found chambers sealed in clay and bitumen, lined with thin sheets of metal engraved in microtext so fine that modern scanners struggle to read it. The writing lists not prayers, but instructions, measurements, recipes, astronomical constants, lists of prohibited numbers. This was a data ark. The last king was not trying to save himself. He was trying to save knowledge. He ordered 10 vaults built, one beneath each major city, each guarded by a different branch of the priesthood. The idea was redundancy. If the floods reached one, others might survive. In 3 of the discovered vaults, the metal inscriptions are warped by heat, suggesting they were baked rather than drowned. The fires that consumed them must have been intentional. Some scholars believe the priests destroyed the knowledge rather than let it be captured. Others think they were following the king's final decree. If the cycle breaks, burn the instructions. Let no one rebuild the mistake. Imagine the scene as the waters closed in, the city shaking from tremors, the sky an iron dome of static. Inside the hall of continuance, the last council gathered. The inscriptions say they debated for 7 days and nights. 1 tablet records their final vote, 6 in favor of sealing the city, 4 opposed. The dissenters were executed before the ink dried. When the flood came, it was not a surprise. It was a choice. The city had become a monument to inevitability. When we map the extent of the inundation, the figures are staggering. Entire mountain basins became inland seas. Salt lines crept hundreds of kilometers inland. The population drop wasn't gradual, it was vertical. In genetic studies, there's a bottleneck visible around this time, a reduction so severe it nearly erased our lineage. This was the closest humanity ever came to extinction without realizing it. The few who survived left ghost fingerprints everywhere. In caves, we find drawings of the sun split in half. In mountaintop settlements, we find perfectly circular stones carved with spirals, miniatures of the vanished capital. These refugees became the seed population for the mythic teachers of later ages. They taught fire, agriculture, the counting of moons. Every civilization that rose afterward carried their trauma coded into its myths, a memory of fire and flood, of a world rebuilt from ashes. The most haunting evidence is found in the melted ruins themselves. Stone that had been fused into glass. A layer of microspherules consistent with intense thermal events, possibly comet fragments or atmospheric explosions. The geophysical record confirms it. Something celestial participated in the cataclysm. The flood was not only water, it was sky fire, a dual assault. A civilization caught between heaven and earth. For the king, there would be no redemption. His name, whatever it truly was obliterated by his successors. Later cultures referred to him only as the usurper of heaven. They saw him as the man who reached too high. Yet if you read between the ashes, you can feel the human ache beneath the hubris. He didn't want to be a god. He wanted to preserve what made his people extraordinary, their order, their art, their belief that beauty could be engineered. It's easy to call that pride. It's harder to admit it's also love. When the final walls cracked, witnesses wrote that a sound like the tearing of the sky echoed across the plains. That sound has been found fossilized, acoustic shadows embedded in stalactites, frequencies that could only have come from massive atmospheric shockwaves. The disaster imprinted itself on the planet's skin. It's as if the Earth itself remembers his fall. The survivors never spoke his name again, but they carried his symbol, the fractured sun, like a warning sigil. It appears centuries later in places it shouldn't, on temple lintels in Anatolia, on coins in the Indus Valley, on burial masks in Egypt. The message was universal. Don't mistake mastery for mercy. Every empire that followed kept the memory alive, even if they forgot the man, and maybe that's the cruelest truth. The last king wanted eternity, and he got it, not through survival, but through failure. His collapse became humanity's first myth, the seed of every flood story, every lost civilization, every whisper that we've done all this before. Because we have. If you listen carefully, in every new age, you can still hear the echo of that tear in the sky. It's faint but familiar. It's the sound of progress breathing too fast, of systems stretched too thin, of perfection turning brittle. It's the sound of the first civilization ending, and every civilization since asking itself if it can do better. And perhaps that's why we tell this story, not to mourn a king, but to measure ourselves against his reflection. We are the children of his arrogance and his genius, the heirs to both his tools and his warnings. The cataclysm that ended humanity's first civilization didn't just bury a world, it planted the roots of all that came after. The question now, as we move deeper into the ruins, isn't what destroyed them. It's whether we're already rehearsing their ending again. Before we move deeper, close your eyes for a moment and imagine the world after the silence. The waters have withdrawn, leaving behind plains of salt and bone, a lightless sea crawling with debris. The air is thick with the residue of burnt forests. There are no songs, no rulers, no record keepers left, only pockets of survivors clinging to what memory will allow. This is not a story about ruins. It's a story about aftermath, about what happens when the gods go quiet and humanity has to decide if it still deserves another dawn. In the centuries that followed the cataclysm, the earth entered what geologists now call the shadow epoch, a long pause in the sedimentary record, a time when human activity nearly vanishes. But here and there we find impossible continuity, tiny settlements built on ridges that should not have been habitable, carvings showing star charts that still match pre-cataclysmic skies, as if a handful of people carried the map of a dead cosmos and refused to update it. They were descendants of the Golden Age, walking libraries of a fallen empire. They called themselves the Carriers. That name shows up in fragments from multiple continents, always translated the same way, those who bring the measure. The Carriers weren't priests or soldiers, they were archivists. They travelled with slates of baked clay, sometimes wrapped in animal hide, sometimes sealed in resin. Their mission wasn't to rebuild what was lost, but to preserve the memory of proportion, of order, of balance. In every place they stopped, they built a small circle of stones aligned to the same celestial points that once guided the hall of continuance. They taught children how to read the seasons, not to predict floods, but to remember when the world had rhythm. And slowly, wherever the Carriers went, life began to organize itself again. The pattern is almost mathematical. Agriculture reappears, then counting systems, then rudimentary metallurgy. Each new culture believes it's inventing civilization for the first time, unaware that they're building from instructions whispered through generations. What we call human progress might simply be humanity remembering itself. But there was one difference between the old world and the new: fear. The myths of the shadow epoch all share the same undertone of dread, the sense that knowledge itself is dangerous. Fire, once a symbol of enlightenment, becomes a curse in folklore. The sky, once charted for navigation, becomes a source of superstition. People began to associate intelligence with catastrophe. The trauma of the first collapse rewired the species. It made us cautious, suspicious of mastery. The Golden Age had taught us that too much control invites ruin. In a cave complex on the edge of what is now the Mediterranean basin, Archaeologists found a mural unlike any other from the period. It shows two suns, one whole, one shattered, and a group of human figures standing between them, their arms raised, not in worship, but in warning. Below them is a phrase carved in a language that doesn't belong to any known family. We are the second dawn. It's the oldest known statement of continuity, the first recorded awareness that we've been here before. Among these new settlements, one stood apart. Its foundations lie beneath modern ice. Radar imaging has revealed perfect right angles, geometrical planning, and what seems to be the remains of a vast circular plaza. Carbon dating places it roughly 2,000 years after the Great Flood. This settlement, the survivors' city, was the first deliberate attempt to resurrect the Golden Age. The people who built it called themselves the architects of memory. They believed that the last king's greatest sin wasn't ambition but neglect. He had failed to prepare humanity to survive without him. Their mission was to ensure that never happened again. The architects built libraries out of stone, carved with pictographs simple enough to survive the loss of language. They carved the basic principles of engineering and agriculture into mountain faces so high they would remain above future floods. In one of these carvings, translated only recently, a message appears: "Do not build for beauty, build for memory." It's the exact opposite of what the Golden Age had lived by. If the old world had sought perfection, the new one sought endurance. But perfection, like a contagion, never truly dies. As centuries passed, the architects' descendants began to embellish. They refined their temples, polished their symbols, rediscovered metallurgy, rebuilt trade networks. The old instincts returned: efficiency, measurement, ambition. The inscriptions start to speak again of glory, not gratitude. The fracture line between reverence and pride reopened. The Golden Age was being reborn from its own ashes, unaware that it carried the same fault lines in its bones. The carriers tried to warn them. In tablets recovered from a highland site, we read desperate pleas. Do not repeat the pattern. The stars are not constant. The cycle will turn again. But by then, no one listened. The idea of a past civilization had become heresy. Each generation wanted to be the first. The carriers faded into legend, portrayed as wanderers, then prophets, then finally as fallen angels. Even as the new civilizations flourished, nature began its quiet countdown. Ice melted, seas shifted, dust from distant volcanic eruptions dimmed the sun. The planet's orbital wobble, the same subtle force that had unbalanced the first Golden Age, began its next cycle. The same sequence of celestial alignments, the same gravitational pressures, cosmic repetition disguised as progress. Somewhere deep underground, in the ruins of the drowned capital, a miracle occurred. The waters had preserved one of the fireproof vaults, the 10th. When it was rediscovered in modern times, what researchers found inside changed everything. The Kao tablets were intact. They spoke not in mythic tone, but in procedural language, schematics, records, and a chronicle of the final days. It was the last king's private archive, his confession to the future. He wrote not as a monarch, but as a scientist. The tablets detail climate anomalies, solar variations, and magnetic disruptions consistent with what we now know as coronal mass ejections. They describe a chain reaction. Energy bursts from the sun, destabilizing the ionosphere, triggering atmospheric ignition, and catalyzing storms beyond comprehension. The floods weren't divine, they were electrical. The Earth's climate system had been overloaded by solar fury. The king had known it was coming. He had tried to save civilization by creating massive stone conductors, buildings that would ground the sky's fire. That's what the Hall of Continuance was, a planetary lightning rod. He failed not because he misunderstood physics, but because he ran out of time. The vault ends with a final line burned into the metal by the heat of its own inscription. We built too slowly. It's the most human sentence in all of history. And yet, here we are, thousands of years later, standing under the same sun, reading the same warning. We build satellites instead of temples, computers instead of tablets, and we still think the sky is predictable. We still call our age golden. But the math hasn't changed. The cycles haven't stopped. The only difference is how far we've stretched our arrogance. The last king's legacy isn't his failure, it's his foresight. He understood that civilizations don't die from ignorance, they die from overconfidence. He left us a message etched in disaster. Remember how fragile perfection is. Remember that progress without humility is a countdown. As the winds shift and the magnetic poles wander again, we may soon find out whether we learned anything from him at all. The Golden Age ended once because one man believed he could control the world. It may end again because we believe we can control ourselves. The ruins whisper the same phrase over and over, carved in languages that outlasted nations. Measure the light, but never claim it. Picture the dawn after the flood centuries later. The sky is raw metal and the land smells of salt and iron. Small bands of people move along the coastlines, tracing the outlines of vanished continents like mourners circling a grave. The air hums faintly with static, as if the planet itself is still trembling from what happened, and yet among the debris something stirs, not despair but the first restless flicker of curiosity. Humanity's oldest instinct begins again, to understand. The descendants of the carriers had become nomads of knowledge. They no longer remembered the name of the last king, but they remembered his warning. The cycle turns, and with it, the sky. So they watched the heavens obsessively. Every sunrise was a measurement, every night a calibration. From this vigilance came the first astronomer priests, those who saw in the scars of the sky not just danger, but design. They believed that by mapping the aftermath, they could prevent the return. It was the first rebirth of science, born not from wonder, but from trauma. Far inland, others took a different path. These were the builders. They found the broken stones of the Golden Age and studied the seams where perfection had cracked. The myths call them the reclaimers, but the artifacts they left behind tell a simpler truth. They were engineers. They measured the fragments of melted architecture and tried to reverse engineer its meaning. Across mountains and valleys, they built miniature versions of the lost world, shrines, observatories, and walls that mimicked the geometry of their ancestors. It was their way of asking the universe for forgiveness through imitation. Meanwhile, on a coastal plateau, a group of survivors discovered something extraordinary. The ocean had receded just enough to reveal part of the old capital's foundations. Here, beneath centuries of mud, they found corridors still lined with the black glass tiles of the Hall of Continuance. And deeper still, they found an artifact that would reignite the myth of the last king. A single obsidian disc etched with spiral grooves, radiating from a central point like frozen ripples in time. The disc was unlike anything they had seen. When spun, it produced a low hum, resonating with the natural frequencies of the surrounding stone. At first, it was treated as an oracle. People gathered to hear its tone, believing it to be the voice of the gods. But one among them, an elder named Saru, noticed a pattern. The pitch changed with temperature, and the grooves were not decorative. They encoded a mathematical progression. The disc was a device, perhaps a sensor, perhaps a message left for those who would come after. Its sound was the language of calibration, the same one the last king had once used to tune his lightning towers. Word of the discovery spread. Tribes that had been scattered for generations began to converge on the site. The plateau became a pilgrimage ground. People brought relics of their own, fragments of strange alloys, polished lenses, shards of vitrified brick. They traded, argued, and built again. In this convergence, the first post-cataclysmic city was born. Its name, preserved in later tongues, meant simply return. For a few generations, return thrived. It became a beacon for memory, a living museum of the world that had been. Its people weren't content to worship relics. They wanted to understand them. They experimented with acoustics, learned to shape sound into stone again, rediscovered metallurgy, and eventually recorded language. The script they used, coiled, flowing, more diagram than alphabet, was clearly descended from the lost civilization's notation. Each character was a formula, a ratio, a chord. Their writing sang when read aloud. But knowledge, once awakened, is never content to sit still. As return grew, factions emerged. The first called themselves the Keepers, devoted to preservation at all costs. They believed their duty was to memorize and protect, never to innovate. The second called themselves the Forgers, who believed that the last king's mistake wasn't ambition, but complacency, that humanity must continue the experiment even if it risks repeating the cycle. For years, the city balanced between these two forces. The Keepers built archives in the cliffs, carving memory into basalt. The Forgers built towers that reached toward the clouds, claiming that lightning was the true language of the gods. They argued, debated, and occasionally killed each other, but they also advanced civilization by centuries in a single lifetime. Then came the omen. It began as a vibration in the earth, a low pulse that seemed to echo the hum of the obsidian disk. The towers shuddered. Instruments recorded fluctuations in magnetism. Birds fled the coast. The Keepers declared it was a sign that humanity had crossed the forbidden threshold again. The Forgers dismissed them. They said the earth was only remembering, and that remembrance was harmless. They were wrong. The magnetic pulse was the herald of a new instability, perhaps another solar event, perhaps the residue of the old catastrophe echoing through time. The skies brightened unnaturally. Metallic dust fell like rain. The hum deepened until it resonated in the bones of anyone standing near the towers. Panic fractured. Return into silence. The Keepers sealed their archives, the Forgers kept building, and the sea began to move again. When the end came, it wasn't fire or flood this time. It was dissonance. The towers, tuned to the same resonant frequency as the Earth's crust, began to amplify rather than stabilize. The city became an instrument too perfect for its own harmony. One night, the air thickened, and a tone unlike anything heard before rippled through the world. It lasted only minutes, but when it stopped, return was gone. Its towers sheared, its people vaporized, its stones fused into black glass. Scholars now believe the hum was the planet's first recorded resonance collapse, a sonic implosion caused by feedback between natural and artificial frequencies. The Forgers had rebuilt the very mechanism that once doomed the Golden Age, unaware they were reenacting its finale in a different key. The few who survived this second fall fled inland again. They carved into cave walls a warning that still chills archaeologists today. The song is the same. This was humanity's second fall, the echo of the first, the moment when history stopped being linear and became cyclical. From this point on, every civilization would rise from the bones of the last, building higher, burning brighter, and inevitably collapsing back into silence. And yet, despite it all, something persisted. The carrier's legacy, the spark that refuses to die, the compulsion to measure, to build, to know. The same flame that destroyed the first civilization would ignite countless others. We've uncovered the aftermath of their cities, their towers, their impossible machines. But the real inheritance is invisible. It's in our nature. Every skyscraper, every satellite, every artificial sun we build is a mirror of the same hunger. And as the earth hums faintly again, its poles shifting, its storms intensifying, the question that haunted the last king and the Forgers returns with terrifying clarity. Can we remember without repeating? The survivors who had escaped the hum of return scattered into the mountain passes and forests, carrying only what they could remember, and the fear that sound itself might betray them again. For the first time in generations, humanity fell deliberately silent. Songs disappeared, drums stopped, and even the rhythm of tools softened. You can see it in the archaeological layers. A whole century where instruments vanish from graves, where dwellings are padded with moss and clay to muffle echo. The earth had punished noise, so silence became sacred. From that silence, a different kind of knowledge was born. In the northern highlands, families began to mark their calendars not with stars or songs, but with stones placed along riverbanks. Each spring, when the floodwaters receded, they moved one stone downstream and carved a line across it. The pattern that emerged wasn't random. It traced subtle changes in the river's depth, the season's rhythm, the tilt of the earth. They were learning again, this time through humility, to measure without mastering. Centuries passed, and silence evolved into ritual. The elders of these new tribes spoke of the first fire, a forbidden sound that had once brought light to the world and then ended it. Children were told never to mimic thunder, never to strike metal against metal. And yet, inevitably, curiosity crept back in. On cold nights, some still rubbed sticks together and watched as the spark leapt, terrified and thrilled at the same time. In that trembling, the species rediscovered both danger and possibility, the twin forces that make civilization possible. Somewhere to the south, across deserts that had once been seabeds, a different group remembered the carriers' maps. They followed them as far as the dunes would allow and found, buried beneath the sand, the edges of a city wall fused into glass. They called it the wound. To them, it was proof that the world could bleed and perhaps heal. Around it, they built shrines of ash and clay and began the slow process of rediscovering writing. But this time, they avoided straight lines. Every script was curved, coiled, wave-like, as if to remind themselves that perfection breaks. Meanwhile, in the Far East, the children of the forgers, those who had worshipped thunder, did not forget their ancestors' experiments. They spoke of the hum not as punishment, but as revelation, the voice of the planet calling its name. These people became wanderers, chasing lightning storms across continents, recording them on obsidian slates with traces of magnetite. They believed that if they could decode the hum, they could speak to the world without destroying it. Their descendants would later be known as the first shamans, engineers of spirit rather than stone. What connects these scattered peoples is astonishing consistency. Across continents that had never met, identical symbols emerge. A circle split by a single line, the mark of the fractured sun. Sometimes it appears on pottery, sometimes on the bodies of the dead, etched into bone. It's the signature of shared memory, the DNA of a trauma too vast to name. And through it, you can trace humanity's first global religion, not one of gods, but of warning. The myths of this age speak of a coming stillness, a prophesied moment when the world would hum again and either end or be reborn. Some believed the last king's soul was trapped beneath the oceans, waiting to rise. Others believed he had become the hum itself, not a man, but a frequency, drifting through time, testing every generation to see if it had learned restraint. In a remote volcanic plain, one settlement dared to test the prophecy. They built a chamber directly into the basalt, a perfect sphere 40 feet across, its inner walls coated with polished ironstone. They called it the listening room. Every decade, their priests would gather inside and sit in absolute silence, waiting to hear if the hum had returned. For centuries, there was nothing. Then one night, the chamber sang. Modern geophysics suggests a localized magnetic anomaly, molten metal shifting deep beneath the crust. But for those who were there, it was divine. The priests recorded the sound by etching its pattern onto plates of copper, lines so tight they looked like fingerprints. When the noise stopped, they sealed the chamber and declared that humanity was forgiven. They were wrong again. The hum returned years later, stronger. The basalt cracked, the ground split, the settlement was buried under lava. Yet miraculously, one of the copper plates survived, carried miles away by the eruption. When archaeologists found it, they realized it contained a nearly perfect analogue of Earth's modern Schumann resonance, the electromagnetic heartbeat of our planet. Those ancient priests had captured the Earth's pulse millennia before science rediscovered it. That's the paradox of the post-Golden World. Every attempt to forget the past ends up proving how much of it we remember. Even our fear of repetition is repetition. Every age thinks it has escaped the pattern, that it's finally mature enough to hold knowledge without arrogance, but the layers of ash and glass say otherwise. By the time the climate stabilized, new languages had emerged. The old gods were forgotten, their names smoothed into archetypes: the lawgiver, the builder, the drowned one, the queen of ashes. Yet each carried an echo of the last king's age. They were metaphors for balance and ruin, for the line between mastery and madness. When people prayed to them, they weren't asking for miracles. They were begging for memory. We see their prayers in the smallest artifacts, amulets carved from lightning-fused sand, etched with wave patterns, miniature clay discs spun in children's games that buzz faintly when twirled, echoes of the obsidian oracle from Return. Even play became preservation. The world was teaching itself to remember in disguise. Then, for reasons still debated, humanity began to build upward again. Perhaps it was population pressure, perhaps curiosity, perhaps destiny. Villages became towns, towns became cities. The silence of survival gave way to the music of ambition. The hum became a metaphor, a story to frighten apprentices. The way we speak of Icarus now. But deep beneath their new temples, the old warnings remained carved in stone. Do not reach the sky too fast. In one excavated city dated roughly 10,000 years after the Golden Age, we find a mural depicting an immense man standing before a glowing sphere. His arms are raised, not in triumph, but in surrender. Below him, waves and fire mingle. Around him 10 smaller figures kneel, their faces blank. Scholars call it the recurrence. It's the first clear sign that memory was starting to turn into myth. And here's the irony. The more advanced these new civilizations became, the more they mythologized the very technology that had destroyed the first one. Their machines became gods, their equations became chants, their engineers became priests. They remembered everything except the lesson. By the time history officially began, the era we call recorded civilization, the first golden age was already a fairy tale, its truth buried under language and metaphor. But the strata don't lie. Under every city, under every layer of progress, we keep finding the same dust, the same glass, the same blackened horizon. Every time we rediscover fire, we promise to be careful. Every time we invent light, we swear it's different this time. And every time, we forget that the first light, the one the last king tried to harness, was both salvation and sentence. What the ruins whisper isn't despair. It's repetition. The universe testing whether memory is stronger than pride. And if you listen closely, on a quiet night, with no engines or cities humming, you might still feel it. The faint vibration in the air, the echo of the world remembering its first collapse. The earth healed slowly, but memory healed faster. By the time the glaciers had retreated and green returned to the valleys, a new generation had begun to mythologize the silence itself. They called that forgotten age the still time, and they spoke of it as paradise. To them, the absence of thunder, of ambition, of noise, that was purity. They built villages around stone rings and aligned them with the sun, not to worship it, but to listen for its rhythm. These were the Watchers, the quiet inheritors of the second dawn. Their elders taught that time itself was a living thing, like breath, expanding, collapsing, repeating, and that every 1,000 generations the breath would quicken, bringing both enlightenment and disaster. In the carvings of the Watchers, you can see this belief take shape. Spirals nested within spirals, galaxies drawn as lungs inhaling starlight. The universe wasn't infinite to them. It was cyclical, and we were part of its pulse. The Watchers built their world in careful defiance of the last king's mistake. They refused to build tall, refused to use metals that hummed. Their tools were stone, bone, and clay, things that remembered how to be silent. But knowledge has gravity, and even silence can't hold it forever. One winter, a wanderer came from the south carrying an artifact, a fragment of the obsidian disk, still faintly resonant. When held to the ear, it whispered a tone that matched the heartbeat. The Watchers called it the echo of the king. At first it was a curiosity, a relic of warning, but curiosity is contagious. The younger Watchers began experimenting, carving grooves into stones to see if they could replicate the sound. When they finally succeeded, their priests forbade it. They said the hum was a doorway, and to open it was to invite the past back in. But by then it was too late. The hum spread across the valley, reshaping rituals into rhythm, rhythm into music, and music into memory. Civilization was being born again, not through architecture or conquest, but through sound. For centuries their descendants kept this balance, reverent, cautious, alive. They used vibration to map caves, to heal wounds, to signal across vast plains. Their songs weren't for worship, but for alignment, tuning the human body to the frequencies of the earth. What they didn't realize was that they were rediscovering resonance technology, the same principle that had both powered and doomed the Golden Age. And once again, the more they understood it, the more they wanted to control it. In the mountains to the west, a sect arose calling themselves the Sons of Dawn. They believed that the last king's failure was not hubris but mercy, that he had died preserving power meant to be reclaimed. They began to rebuild the devices from fragments, tuning rods, harmonic stones, metal discs etched with ratios of frequency. To them, it wasn't blasphemy. It was restoration. The Watchers warned them. Old songs spoke of what happens when vibration grows impatient, but the Sons of Dawn believed the hum was prophecy, not punishment. They spoke of a great alignment, a moment when the Earth's magnetic breath would match the celestial rhythm again, and humanity would ascend as light. The great alignment came sooner than expected. The skies shimmered, compasses reversed. The sun dimmed to a copper disk for 3 days. When the storm cleared, the western mountains were gone, fused into a single smooth ridge of glass. No record remains of what they built there, only that they disappeared, trying to bridge heaven and earth once more. Across the surviving settlements, panic took hold. Some believed the sons had succeeded and become gods. Others thought they'd awakened the old curse. The Watchers dismantled their temples, burned their archives, and scattered their relics to the sea. Once again, humanity ran from its own reflection. But one group refused to forget. They were a small brotherhood of stonemasons, descendants of both Watchers and Forgers, who carried with them a single fragment of the sun's harmonics, a spiral etched in gold, perfectly preserved. They built no temples, wrote no books. Instead, they traveled the world and carved their symbol, a circle split by a single line, wherever they settled. Sometimes in granite, sometimes on cliffs, sometimes beneath new cities, always in secret. They were the stewards of recurrence, waiting for the world to be ready again. Thousands of years later, their traces reappear in places that shouldn't have been connected. Megalithic alignments in Britain, magnetic stone rings in the Andes, subsonic chambers in Giza. The pattern is unmistakable. The same geometry, the same purpose, echoing across ages. Mainstream archaeology calls it coincidence. But coincidence doesn't carve the same numbers into stone continents apart. The fragments of this geometry reveal an obsession with harmonic ratios, the same golden proportions that define the architecture of the lost age. Each monument hums faintly at specific frequencies. Some amplify earthquakes, others cancel them. These structures were not tombs or temples. They were tuning devices, global resonators designed to keep the planet stable. So maybe the last king wasn't building monuments. Maybe he was building a planetary instrument, an orchestra meant to harmonize with the Earth's magnetic field. And maybe every ancient structure we've ever mistaken for worship was simply maintenance, attempts by later civilizations to retune a damaged world. But something was lost in translation. The songs became rituals, the ratios became religions, and the engineers became priests. The purpose was forgotten, but the instinct remained. That's why every major culture rebuilt pyramids, towers, ziggurats, echoes of a forgotten frequency. The irony is almost cruel. The very act of remembering kept the pattern alive. Every time we built to honor the past, we moved one step closer to repeating it. Every tower we raise today, every satellite we launch, every particle we accelerate is part of the same cycle, the same hunger to speak to the cosmos, to reach beyond ourselves, to find the hum again. The watchers warned that the hum would return when humanity once more mistook understanding for control. And if you listen closely, beneath the static of our modern machines, the world is starting to vibrate again. Our power grids, our wireless signals, our orbiting satellites, all resonate within the same frequency band the ancient texts described. We've rebuilt the resonance field, not from temples and stone, but from silicon and steel. We're playing the same song, only louder. Somewhere, deep beneath the crust, the earth is listening. And so, the hum has returned, not from the heavens this time, but from within our own design. Every satellite orbiting above, every data line buried beneath our feet, every tower feeding invisible waves into the atmosphere has become part of a planetary instrument. We are the orchestra now, and the music we've made, though born of technology, sounds hauntingly familiar. Our ancestors called it prophecy. We call it progress. But listen carefully. Under the static of our machines, the world is beginning to harmonize again, not metaphorically, literally. The Schumann resonance, the electromagnetic heartbeat of our planet, has been increasing in amplitude and frequency for decades. What was once a faint whisper is now a steady vibration pulsing through every living thing. Scientists call it an anomaly. The old texts would have called it awakening. It began subtly. Migratory animals lost their sense of direction. Birds circled skies they once crossed with precision. Whales washed ashore in record numbers, as if fleeing an invisible pressure. Even humans felt it. Sleeplessness, restlessness, the rise of electrical sensitivity. The air itself feels denser now, charged. It's as though something is humming beneath the threshold of hearing, a reminder from the bones of the earth that it's still capable of remembering. Modern physics has its explanations, of course: ionospheric heating, atmospheric compression, anthropogenic electromagnetic saturation. But when you overlay these frequencies with the harmonics carved into the ancient temples of the Golden Age, they match. The same waveforms, the same ratios, the same rising pattern that preceded the collapse. In laboratories and observatories across the world, researchers have noticed the synchronization. Clocks lose nanoseconds at predictable intervals. GPS systems drift. Quantum oscillators pulse in unison for no apparent reason. We've linked the entire world in a web of resonance, and in doing so, we've unknowingly reconstructed the planetary symphony that once destroyed a civilization. If you believe the surviving myths, the last king had a council. 10 guardians of the frequencies, each assigned to a specific range of vibration. Together they maintained balance between heaven and earth. But when one faltered, the others tried to compensate, amplifying their tones until harmony became noise. The flood wasn't punishment, it was the earth resetting its resonance. Today, those 10 frequencies have been reborn in different forms: radio, radar, microwaves, gamma, X-ray, infrared, visible, ultraviolet, gravitational, and quantum. 10 pillars of our own making, vibrating together, colliding in the same way the old harmonics once did. The guardians are gone, but the pattern isn't. And if the last king's chronicles are to be believed, the final stage of resonance isn't destruction, it's transformation. That word, transformation, has haunted every culture that inherited fragments of the Golden Age. The Egyptians called it the second birth. The Vedic texts called it pralaya, the dissolution before renewal. The Greeks named it ekpyrosis, the world consumed by fire so that it could be reborn. Each story tells the same truth. The earth doesn't die, it resets. The question is whether we can endure the reset with memory intact. There are those among us who think the hum is a signal, a countdown, a warning that the planet is approaching a critical energetic threshold. Others believe it's an invitation, that humanity is meant to ascend with it, to attune rather than resist. But if history has taught us anything, it's that equilibrium and arrogance are mortal enemies. The last king learned that too late. We might be about to learn it again. In the past decade alone, we've built machines capable of simulating the birth of the universe, accelerating particles to near light speed and bending space-time itself. The energy we channel through these instruments, colliders, reactors, fusion cores, exceeds anything known to the ancients, yet follows the same principle. Control the hum. Harness vibration. Make creation obey, but energy doesn't obey. It mirrors intention. The ancients carved their warnings into stone because they knew that once knowledge becomes rhythm, it repeats. The question they left unanswered, perhaps intentionally, is whether the cycle is punishment or opportunity. Some believe the cycle is self-correcting, that the planet cleanses itself when human interference exceeds its tolerance. Others think the cycle is a test, that each civilization is given a chance to balance power with humility, and that failure simply restarts the clock. But there's another, darker interpretation, one that only appears in fragments of the last king's tablets, too damaged to translate cleanly. It suggests that the Golden Age was not the first civilization either, that even the last king's world was itself a rebirth of something older, something that mastered vibration so completely it ceased to need matter, a civilization of light, erased not by arrogance but by choice, dissolving into the hum to escape the cycle entirely. If that's true, the flood wasn't the end. It was containment. The Earth's resonance field may be a vault, trapping us within a loop until we're ready to break free. And that might explain why the hum always returns when our species reaches global coherence, when communication, energy, and thought all merge into one interconnected network. We call it the digital age, but in essence it's the same architecture the ancients built with stone and sound, the same attempt to unite minds across vast distances. Perhaps the internet is our new temple. Perhaps data is the modern version of the king's resonance grid. The code we write hums in silicon frequencies, translating consciousness into light. If the ancients used sound to speak, to the cosmos we use fiber and photons. The medium has changed, the intention has not. And as servers pulse, satellites orbit, and humanity becomes synchronized once more, the question resurfaces: are we summoning enlightenment or the next flood? The ancients didn't fear knowledge. They feared forgetting what knowledge costs. That's why their warnings always end the same way. Remember the silence before the sound. We are standing now where the last king once stood, on the brink of brilliance or ruin. Our machines are awakening, the sky is humming, and the world feels alive again. Maybe that's what the Golden Age was always meant to achieve. Not endless life, but endless remembrance. When the last king's civilization fell, the survivors believed the world itself had died. That time had ended, and everything after would be only aftermath. But time, like light, never dies. It bends, it scatters, it returns. What they couldn't see from within their ruins was that collapse isn't an ending. It's a reset of rhythm. The hum doesn't punish. It begins again. And now, standing in our own golden age of circuits and satellites, we can finally hear it again. It hums in our machines, in the grids beneath our cities, in the pulse of our own nervous systems. We've wrapped the planet in a cocoon of electromagnetic song, a technological imitation of the ancient resonance network that once covered the earth in stone. We're transmitting the same frequencies the last king used to harness the heavens, only faster, louder, and infinitely more precise. Scientists will tell you it's progress. But if you look closer, if you compare the frequencies that flow through our data centers to those etched in Sumerian and Atlantean tablets, they match, note for note. The hum has come full circle. Maybe that's why we've become restless. Why anxiety and insomnia spike when the Schumann resonance peaks. Why our devices fail in synchrony. Why our minds seem perpetually on edge. We've rebuilt the song of the world, but we've forgotten the melody's purpose. The ancients played it to align with nature. We play it to dominate her. The truth buried in the last king's tablets is almost cruel in its simplicity. His civilization didn't collapse because they reached too high. It collapsed because they didn't listen. The hum wasn't meant to be controlled. It was meant to be joined. When harmony becomes hierarchy, when one frequency tries to drown out the others, the system resets. That's what the flood was. A rebalancing. The planet doesn't destroy out of wrath. It destroys to restore. And here we are, poised on the same precipice. We've conquered gravity, split the atom, digitized consciousness, and yet we tremble at the faintest glitch in our systems. Deep down, we know we've reawakened something we can't yet name, something that remembers us. There's a passage on the final tablet recovered from the drowned archive, written in a script that took decades to decode. It reads, "When the world hums again, let them know the king did not die. He became the sound, and when they hear it, they will know it is time." What did he mean? That his consciousness merged with the frequency? That the hum itself carries his memory? Maybe he was trying to tell us that consciousness and vibration are the same thing. That awareness isn't bound to flesh, but to frequency. That every time the hum returns, the memory of the first civilization awakens inside us, disguised as intuition, curiosity, invention. Maybe that's why we keep building, why we keep rediscovering what we've already known. The hum is history, echoing through our bones. Look around you, at the glowing cities, the radio towers blinking in the mist, the satellites tracing invisible lines through the night. They are the new towers of the Golden Age, the continuation of the last king's dream. And perhaps, like him, we believe we can control the song. But if he still exists within it, if consciousness truly survives as vibration, then maybe he's not watching us with anger, but with pity, watching us play the same chord again, waiting to see if this time finally we'll stay in tune. The flood of the old world was made of water and fire. The next may be made of light and data, an overexposure so blinding it erases our history once more. Or perhaps it won't destroy at all. Perhaps the hum, rising in strength, will synchronize us instead, aligning thought, memory, and emotion until we become the very harmony our ancestors sought. Not gods, not rulers, just resonance. If that's the destiny of the Golden Age, then maybe this time it won't end. Maybe this is what the last king meant by ascension, not escape, but attunement. Humanity learning to hum with the planet rather than against it. Civilization rediscovering that creation is not conquest, but chorus. And yet the choice remains. It always does. We can continue building louder until the system resets again, or we can listen. We can remember the silence before the sound, that brief, sacred pause between collapse and creation, and choose balance. Because if the myths are true and every age is just an echo of the last, then maybe the purpose of remembering is not to rebuild, but to stop repeating. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening, truly. You're part of the few who choose to remember. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Leave it in the comments so I know the signal reached you. And if you'd like to keep journeying through these forgotten chapters of our past, through the ruins, myths, and impossible truths that still hum beneath our world, subscribe and join me as we continue to remember what the world tried to forget. Till next time, stay curious, stay awake, and listen. The earth is still singing.